And guess what? On our show today, we are going to talk about something that happens to almost every last one of us. And that is grief and loss, the pain of it, the sting of it, and the sometimes struggle of it as well. Today's conversation is going to dive a little bit more deeply into, can grief and loss cause us that still remain to also want to die? That's going to be the question of the hour. Can you actually perish because you've grieved so hard for something or someone? It suggests that we should take a better look at how we self-care so that we don't mishandle the things that we care for the most. So stay tuned. Live with Lakita coming right back at you. Hello everyone, this is Lakita Long and you are watching Live with Lakita, and we are so excited that you are here at this moment. If you've been watching and following us, and you know that we have been talking about a variety of things that impact and affect our lives every single day. One of the things that is true about the topic we're going to talk about today is that this topic has absolutely impacted probably every single person in the world in some shape, form, or fashion. We all know and or know someone who's been gravely impacted by grief and loss. Grief and loss carries such a heavy weight. The looming effect of the loss of someone you love that you cannot get back, and or the inability to connect with someone if you've had disagreements or strained relationships and they perish or they go away. Or how about the fact that you have an unexpected death of some nature, or a loss of a job, or a divorce, or just a loss of self? All those things lead to a level of grief and loss. And we're going to talk about the gravity of that when it is not dealt with properly. Then we will find ourselves in a really, really sticky situation. To help us with our conversation on today is someone who is all very acquainted with grief and loss. Much too soon for her likings, but we're going to find out what happened and what she did. So will you guys please all join in with me as we celebrate our guest today, Miss Brenda Maupins. Welcome to Live with Lakita.
Thank you, Lakita.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to have you here. So let's talk for just a moment. I mean, prior to the grief and loss that you experienced,
Yes.
Did you know grief and loss to that level?
Not to that level.
Okay. Had you ever experienced any grief and loss prior?
Prior, I had experienced grief and loss through losing a brother at a young age, and then my aunt, but never anyone as personal as my own child.
And let's talk for a moment. I mean, you think about the overwhelming stress that it creates and all those things, and it's your child.
Yes.
And I want you to just kind of get us up to speed a little bit about what happened, what was going on in your life at that moment that constitutes the real deep sorrow of the grief and the loss. Share with us.
In that moment, prior to losing my little King David, I was a busy mom. I was a mom that took my boys everywhere. And I was admired. I looked like I was 15 at the time, strolling two twins, and I would get stopped everywhere I went. And those boys were my world. And even prior to having my boys, Dr. Lakita, I didn't know until 12 hours before they were born that I was having twins. And so David was the one hiding. So their hearts were together, and they thought it was a strong heartbeat. So never did they know until I developed toxemia. And I got real sick. And my mother came to pick me up one day, and she said, I'm going to take you to the doctor. She said, I'll be back in a few minutes. When she got back, I had my bags packed. She said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to the doctor, but I'm not coming back home. And so, so we got...
That's a black woman for you. I'm packing my bags, and we're going to the doctor, but I ain't coming back.
I'm not coming back home. So I go to the doctor, and my mom's showing the doctor. She said, this is what my daughter used to look like. She doesn't look like that. And Dr. Cordero said, Brenda, Brenda, Brenda. So, so he wanted to do x-rays. And so they went up and took x-rays of me. And all I remember is the nurse doing something with her hands. And apparently she went like this, which were 2 babies. And my mom started to scream. And so before we knew, I was upstairs, and the doctor comes in, he opens up the drapes and shows me that I have 2 babies. And my heart and my blood pressure was so high that I couldn't contain it, and they had to deliver my babies through C-section.
Wait, she was so excited. Wait, she was so excited. The excitement sent her blood pressure all the way up. Let's contain our excitement. No, I'm just kidding. Be excited. But so now you had the babies.
I had my babies.
Okay. And so we're talking about
1983.
Okay, you had the twins.
Yes.
And the month of May. And then life goes on. You're a busy mom. You're doing all these things. And then what happens?
And then what happens is I was at work. I had a wonderful daycare provider by the name of Carolyn, and she would take care of my boys for me every day. She would make sure that my boys were bathed and fed before I even picked them up. They had their pajamas on. And this particular day, which was December 21st, 1983, I was trying to get a hold of my ex-husband. And typically he's always there. He takes one child out of the car, and then I take the other. And this day I couldn't get a hold of him, not knowing that he was at the neighbors down the street waiting for me. And so by me not being able to get a hold of him, I decided 45 minutes that it was time for me to leave. And all I remember was Carolyn saying, "Brenda, be safe." And I said I will, because it was a rainy day. And I never made it home. I drove the freeway, and there was a lot of traffic. Actually, there was another accident the same day, and there was a woman's car that had burned up, and her daughter was watching her as she burned. And the gentleman behind me, which his name is Daniel, he didn't notice that I had stopped. And when I stopped, he was still going 60 miles per hour.
Oh.
And so when he hit me, the impact of the vehicle actually broke apart the car seat, which was a strolley. It was metal. And the metal actually cut my son's skull all the way around, but I didn't know in that moment. All I saw was blood. And so, of course, I didn't know it was a freeway. Just so happened, by the grace of God, there was a ambulance that was already there. And so the ambulance, when they came this way, they took little David, first, and then they took Jason, which is my other son, his twin. And I remember in the ambulance, I run across, and I look at my son, and he gives me the biggest giggle. He always giggled. That was my little King David, and he always giggled. And they kept him in the back while I went to the hospital. I had gone through the windshield, and they were trying to, prevent me from bleeding. But at the time, when I got to the hospital, they gave my son a shot. I didn't know that my son wasn't going to make it. And I do remember this. It was the 21st, the 23rd, the doctor comes to me and he says, "I think you need to go home and you need to take a shower and then come back." And I said, "I can't leave my son." And he said, "But you need to go home and take a shower." So I did. My mother took me home. I did not get in the shower. And when the phone rang, I knew it was the doctor calling about my son. And my mom looked at me. And I broke down. And that's when the pain and the loss and the grief struck. I didn't know about grief until that moment when he said my son was gone, because I didn't believe it.
So, and I want, just for a moment, because, I thought that he had died because he was, some other causes. And so, and then it makes sense now in other conversations we had about that you had a serious car accident. And so now piecing all the pieces together, that it was the thing that, struck him and all of that and the after effect. And I want to pause for a moment because even just listening to the story, and in psychology and in counseling as a therapist, I can feel the pain of it. I can feel the grief and the loss. It's called transference. And so it's like in the moment. And so if you can identify and if you can feel a thing, then if you've watched our other session that we talked about trapped trauma, then you know that trauma can definitely get trapped in your body if I can feel what she's saying. And I just want you guys to just think about it. So now you know that little King David is gone.
Yes.
and now you're feeling like you're almost gone.
Yes.
And so in that moment, you still had King Jason still left.
Yes.
And but what's going on in your head? Because grief is a lingering thing. It
Yes.
puts you in a place of denial. You start bargaining. You start
Yes.
doing all the stages that grief provides. What starts happening for you then?
For me, I had to suppress my grief in that moment because my ex-husband broke down. And as women, we always have to find a way to pick ourselves up. So in that moment, I knew I had to be there for him. So I suppressed that grief for the time being. And when I finally was able to realize that I lost my son, it was like I was choking. And it was almost like an out-of-body experience where I could see my heart on the outside of my body, just beating. And I remember one day saying, God, I can't do this. I cannot do this without my son. I cannot live without my son. And grief transfers for me to almost like a suicide moment.
And that is so powerful because Sheryl Sandberg, she was the COO of Facebook. She wrote a wonderful book called Option B. And she has a story at the beginning of the book where she talks about how she suddenly had lost her husband of 13 years and they had children. He just was working out. They were at a resort with a bunch of friends. And she said that. She said that grief was a suffocating disease. It's a thing that suffocates the life out of you.
It does.
And I think that analogy fits to what you're saying. So here you're feeling the grief of it all, but it feels like the sting of suicide.
It does.
And so then what happened?
So what happened was I just remember one day driving and said, Lord, if I can't have my son, then I don't need to live. And I remember taking my hands off the steering wheel and I remember speeding up. And all I remember were horns blowing. And in that moment, I don't know if it was God. I believe it has to be. And I stopped. And I remember saying to myself, King Jason is still alive. And at that point, also, I had my daughter. And I could not leave my children. But in that moment is when I knew I needed help. I knew I could not do this alone. And I knew that I needed something bigger. And that's when I sought God. I really did. I sought God like I never sought him before. And I remember saying, Lord, you give strength to the weary.
Yeah.
I was so in a bad place.
And you were in that space. I think you told me you were in that space, Brenda, for 5 years.
For 5 years.
I mean, and some people never get out of that space.
Yes.
And we want to tell you that we're not here to tell you to move on and get over it. But we are telling you that there are some really serious things that happens to our bodies and our minds and our spirits if we let a thing linger without us doing something about it. Go to God in prayer. Talk to a therapist. Talk to counselors. Do something. Is so important. So 5 years are gone. You realize, like, I need help. And then what starts to happen?
I went to, it was, to be honest, my church had a revival. And I was invited to the revival. I mean, I was asked to come to the revival. And I just remember this particular day, there was 2 women in my church who really loved me and knew I was going through this trauma. And I surrendered that night. I remember surrendering it unto God. I didn't know even whether the pain was going to go away, but I just knew I had to let it go. And I knew that I could no longer run from God, but I had to run to God. And I ran to him. And I remember Isaiah 40:30.
My favorite.
Those, you know, and that was the one thing that got me through. And Psalms 23 got me through. And really the part that got me through was going through the valley of the shadow of death, for me not to fear any evil because he would be with me. And God didn't say that I had to stop, that I had to travel through the shadow of death. And that I would fear no evil, and that he would be with me. And that his love endures forever. And that began the healing process. And I just began to surrender that thing. And even in those moments, I learned that my son is only dead if I don't keep him alive. And I began to celebrate. I began to celebrate my baby, my King David. So I celebrate him to this day. On December 23rd, I used to cry, and now I celebrate his life. And those, I lost my dad since, I celebrate his life. And I've learned that really that death is a part of life. And it's a cycle, and it's a process that we go through.
And I think that, Brenda, you really summed it up very nicely. And I think that sometimes we don't realize that death is a part of life because many people don't want to talk about death. But the truth of the matter is we all will have to die at some appointed time.
Yes.
Once appointed a man to die, and then, comes the judgment. It's a wonderful verse in scripture, but it reminds us that we're not here forever, but we can live forever, not in the way we desire to. And I think that while we feel so good being alive, I think that we have to look at the reality of the other side. One of the things that I wanted to do in doing this particular segment is to look at the immense gravity that grief and loss takes from us as well. The loss of productivity, the loss of interest when connecting with people that you love. You kind of start getting into yourself. But to look at the gains that you can get. She realized I need to celebrate those who are still alive. And had she maybe not had that experience, then when your father would have died, maybe that could have been another situation. But she learned. So everything about life is about learning. And we wanted to make sure that you understood that. That nothing has to be final unless you stop celebrating. I really love that when you said that. That was just so really powerful. He doesn't have to be dead. That's what you said.
Right.
Unless you stop celebrating and bringing him back to life. And so, so tell us. So where are you at now? Because I know just even talking about the story and how is King Jason doing and all that stuff. So bring us up to date.
Yeah. So today I'm living life and I'm loving life. And I'm loving every minute of life. And I take life is such a vapor. And so I make every day a point to smile.
Yes.
I make every day a point to give compliments. I make every day a point to tell the people that are in my life that I love them. And including my children, there's not a day that goes by where I don't tell them I love them. And I do.
Wow. I hope that this segment, this time, would just kind of make you a little bit more reflective about your grief and loss experience. Here, please understand that no one wants you to just move on and get over it.
Right.
That's definitely not the thrust here. The thrust is for you to understand what you can do when someone that you love has passed on or when you've lost something that means so much to you. Do not hang on to it so long, so hard, that it starts to augment or transform who you are mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, and psychologically. Grief and loss really, really affects people more than they know. It also affects them in a very invisible way, that mental way, where you're constantly thinking, could I have done more?
Yes.
Should I have done more? And she's probably thinking about, because she brought out all the details of what was told to her, be safe, on the road. Did they foresee something? Did she know something? All these things play in your head.
What I could have done differently.
What could you have done differently? Could you have swerved?
Right.
And none of that is going to do what is needed to be done in terms of bringing back our King David. But what I can see is that it's built you and made you strong.
It has.
And made you resilient. And I think that when we learn that even through loss, we can still last and be powerfully engaging, I think that's the power of life. And so if you've been watching, we're so grateful. And Miss Brenda Maupins, we appreciate you for joining us today on this show. Is there any last things that you would like to share with our audience that might be of an encouragement to them if they are struggling in the areas of grief and loss?
I just want to say that if you are struggling in the areas of grief and loss, it's not something that you can do on your own. Talk to a friend, talk to your family, seek God, and just know that that in time, and that you will be okay. But know that no one could ever take away what you cherish in your heart. And that's what I did with my little King David. No one could ever take him away from me because he rests right here in my heart, and I will love him forever. And one day I know that I will see my baby again. So learn to just enjoy every moment of life as we have those that we love around us. That's what I would say.
So thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you so much. And just the braveness of who you are. I really, really appreciate you. And for those mothers that are out there that are struggling with the lost child of your own, I pray great comfort to you. And I pray that you will find the solitude that you need in order to be the whole individual you desire. Should you find yourself in an overwhelming space of grief, and after turning to God in times of prayer or meditation, you're still feeling an overwhelmness, please make sure to reach out to someone. If you're in any city locally, you can reach out to a 211 number or a 311 number, and it will lead you to a variety of different resources. We thank you so much for joining us on Live with Lakita, and may God bless you and your family.
There are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Grief is the process an individual goes through after losing a significant person or element from their life. While grief is usually associated with the loss of human life, that is not the only cause of grief. Any significant loss can be emotionally difficult and disruptive for an individual, and it can also cause complicated grief in some people. Here's a few common causes of grief: death of a loved one, suicide loss, divorce, loss of a job, or death of a pet. Every year, grief costs the workplace $75 billion. If you are experiencing symptoms of grief and loss, here are 10 things to be mindful of. There is no time limit on grief. Grief needs to be shared. Keep communication open. Get support, plenty of it. Previous family stress plays a role. The level of your prior emotional connection is important. Rituals help in remembering. Talk about the person who died. Keep busy and active in your church. And come to terms with forgiveness. For more information, please visit www.mhicnow.org.
Thank you for watching the Live with Lakita episode, and please be back with us next week as we talk about addictions and our relationship with it with our special guest, Bernice Cooper, licensed marriage family therapist and addiction specialist. Look forward to seeing you next week.
To join the LDL Empowerment Group, please visit us at ldlempowermentgroup.com.